Good afternoon. Welcome and thanks for joining us for today's HIS Talk webinar, Improve Care and Save Clinician Time by Streamlining Specialty Drug Prescribing. It's brought to you by ZAPP RX. I'm Lori from HIS Talk and I'll be moderating. I have a couple of housekeeping items to make you aware of before we start the webinar. Attendee phone lines have been muted to prevent background noise. Please use GoToWebinar's questions box in the console to submit questions to our presenters at any time. The presenters will answer your questions during Q&A at the end. Today's webinar is being recorded, so you'll receive a link to the recording as well as a PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. We have two speakers today. First up will be Karen Tarazi, VP of Solutions at ZAPP RX. Joining Karen will be Jeremy Feldman, MD. Dr. Feldman is the Director of the Pulmonary Hypertension and Advanced Lung Disease Program and Medical Director of Research at Arizona Pulmonary Associates. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Karen.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar, and thank you, Dr. Feldman, for this afternoon. As Lori mentioned, Dr. Feldman is the Director of Pulmonary Hypertension and Advanced Lung Disease Program at Arizona Pulmonary Specialists. And we know that he's an innovator on the clinical side of the world, and we were so thrilled when we met Dr. Feldman to learn that he's also an innovator on the technology side of things. He's been an incredible sort of champion of figuring out how to make all of this done easier, in addition to getting fantastic clinical care for his patients. So thanks, Dr. Feldman, for joining us today. As Lori mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Solutions here at ZAPP RX, and essentially that means that it's my responsibility to sort of sew the fabric of this solution together, which is in part a solution that we've built ourselves here at ZAPP RX, but also a part of a broader community of partnerships that ultimately contribute to addressing this issue of difficulty prescribing specialty medications and making it easier for everyone involved. And so let me, if you don't mind, set the stage for what we're going to talk about today, really from where all of this starts, and that's with the patient. So there's this moment that a patient is given some terrible news that they've been diagnosed with a disease that's life-altering, potentially life-shortening, and they are referred to someone like Dr. Feldman for help. The good news is Dr. Feldman has some tools at his disposal, and he has some therapies that he can offer this patient. Now's where things start to get complex. So the therapies that we're talking about here are considered specialty medications, which means they are dispensed by pharmacies that are not the type of pharmacies that you can get, not the type of drugs that you can get at your corner drugstore. These are ones that go through specialty pharmacies with somewhat complicated processes to actually get them approved and dispensed to the patient. So Dr. Feldman and his team will decide on a therapy for this particular patient, and then the process from there becomes a very manual one as it stands today prior to ZAPP RX. Oftentimes they'll have to go to a biopharma hub and download an enrollment form and hand fill it out and send that back to the hub, particularly if there's a REMS program mandated for that prescription. That usually kicks off a back and forth between Dr. Feldman's staff and the hub. Perhaps there's something illegible on the form or something missing on the form. The fax didn't get through. So there's some back and forth that happens there by old-fashioned fax machine. Perhaps the hub tells Dr. Feldman's staff which pharmacy can actually fill this medication. That kicks off another process with the specialty pharmacy, typically also paper-based, fax-based, back and forth with the pharmacy. Eventually, they get pointed in the right direction for which payer to go to get the therapy approved. There we have another process, so another sort of lengthy prior authorization process where the clinicians are gathering clinical information to submit to the payer, and then the payers may have follow-up questions, and that back and forth happens. All of this is happening while the patient is sitting and waiting for this therapy that will potentially arrest their disease progression or alleviate the symptoms that they're having from it. Now, eventually, of course, the patient does get on therapy, and the healing can start. However, when you think about this, both from the provider and the patient perspective, the patient's in the dark the whole time, and the provider may be prescribing more than one therapy. And that therapy, the second therapy, might be from a different biopharma. So then you have the whole process again with different players involved. So different biopharma, potentially a different specialty pharmacy. And then you add, of course, that Dr. Feldman sees multiple patients. So you can see pretty quickly that this becomes untenable for those that are trying to provide care to these patients. And then, of course, for every patient in his practice, they're having to sit with this anxiety of waiting for this therapy to come to them that they know is really going to make a huge difference in their life. And so the solution that we've designed here at ZAPP would allow for clinicians like Dr. Feldman to log into a single platform that has connections to all of these other stakeholders involved in the process. So we would be connected directly to the biopharma hub, connected to the specialty pharmacies dispensing the medication, and to the payers to do prior authorization, and ultimately giving transparency to all of this to the patient so they can see where things are in the process and getting the therapy shipped to them in an expedited way than they experience today. So the idea here is for all of the stakeholders that are involved to have benefit from this type of platform. ZAPP is agnostic to the biopharma company, to the specialty pharmacy. Really, we want all of these participants in the platform to ease the burden of this process for everyone involved. Ultimately, the patient gets on therapy quicker and has better transparency into the process, and we hope overall reduces the stress during the process and allows for better disease management. From the provider's perspective, we hope to lower the overall administrative cost and burden to this process and take the time that clinicians are spending today on this paperwork process and give them increased time to focus on patient care. For the specialty pharmacies, they will receive clean and complete prescriptions from providers on the first try, which we overall think will increase adherence and improve dispensing times. For the biopharma companies, we looked for them to be able to see an improved experience for the patients overall, faster onboarding, which we believe will reduce abandonment, and overall reduce the onboarding cost. For the payer, we hope to reduce the cost of approval and improve the member experience and satisfaction during the process. So that's the landscape that we're going to cover today and that Dr. Feldman will talk through. Let me just give a couple of words about ZAPP and who we are as a company. We're a relatively young company. We first launched our product in December of 2015, and really the platform is broadly for specialty drug prescribing. And though we started in the pulmonary space, and that's what Dr. Feldman will speak to today, we're also focused on the areas of rheumatology, oncology, neurology, and gastroenterology. We're about a 40-person team at this point, having raised $41 million to date, with companies such as SR1, which is the GlaxoSmithKline venture arm, Qiming GV, formerly known as Google Ventures, and Atlas Venture. You know, our story really started with a personal experience from our CEO, where her brother had a prolonged time in getting diagnosed with epilepsy and then compounding that with a slow delivery of the medication to help him. So, you know, those of us, the 40 of us that are here, many of us come from a personal experience or a formal clinical background, and we're really hoping that this solution for all of the stakeholders involved will ultimately get patients on therapy faster and get them to a better place. I'll also note that our solution is one that's hosted in AWS, and we are third-party certified that we're HIPAA compliant and anticipating high trust certification in Q2 of 2018. So that's a little bit about us, and from here, I'm going to ask Dr. Feldman to take over. Thank you, Dr. Feldman.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Arizona Pulmonary Specialists is a very large pulmonary practice, which has branched into some other areas of subspecialty. We've currently have about 37 physicians and 2 nurse practitioners and a cadre of nurses and administrative support staff, and we have a research team with 5 coordinators. And this allows us to see more than 30,000 patient encounters a year. And over the last 15 years, we've developed a deep interest in pulmonary hypertension and an expanding interest in pulmonary fibrosis. And this is really where our interaction with ZAPP began. Other specialties in our group include infectious disease. We have an interventional pulmonary arm, as well as sleep medicine, endocrinology, and rheumatology, and we probably will be growing further over the next year or 2. Next slide. So pulmonary hypertension, we have a couple cartoons displayed in front of you, is fundamentally a disease of the blood vessels of the lungs. The pulmonary arteries convey blood from the right side of the heart through the lungs where they pick up oxygen. And those blood vessels in pulmonary arterial hypertension become diseased and the passage become narrowed, and it's harder for the right ventricle to pump blood. And this is a highly morbid disease. In the untreated natural history, the average survival is less than 3 years. Pulmonary fibrosis is a disorder of the lung tissues where scar tissue replaces normal lungs. And similar to pulmonary hypertension, average untreated survival is about 3 years. So although these are 2 unrelated diseases, we actually have some similarities in their natural history. We also have some similarities in the complexity of treating them. With pulmonary arterial hypertension, we've learned over the last 15 years that a more aggressive regimen of combination therapy earlier in the course of disease leads to better outcomes. And our program employs heavy use of parenteral prostanoid therapy, such as subcutaneous and intravenous treprostinil. 3 main drug classes, the PDE5 inhibitors, the endothelin receptor antagonists, and then the prostacyclin and prostaglandin agonists, which are delivered via infused, inhaled, and oral routes. Next slide. So with that background, we can say that pulmonary hypertension is a very bad disease to have. There is no cure despite the progress that we've made. Patients remain quite symptomatic, and it has a huge impact on their quality of life. Unfortunately, it still is underdiagnosed. We still meet patients that are presenting very late in the disease course, and this leads to death and debility. Medications are complicated. They have lots of side effects. They are, in general, all supplied by specialty pharmacies, and so we have complex interactions with the healthcare system. In order to deliver optimal care in this complex environment really requires a significant infrastructure, with the Pulmonary Hypertension Association recently acknowledging and accrediting centers of excellence. Next slide. So if we start with the beginning of how we prescribe medications for patients with this disease, going back to the old age of last year when we weren't partnered with ZAPP, patient would come to us, we'd see them, we'd decide clinically that we wanted to start them on a medication. My nurse coordinators would start filling out paperwork. We'd have to get paper signature from the patient, and then we would start this laborious process of the prior authorization. Papers would be faxed to the specialty pharmacy or to a biopharma hub. Oftentimes there's a back and forth, and we have very little visibility into this as there's no real portal system to track the progress. This led to an average of 3 to 7 days to complete the prior authorizations and really enter the process formally. A third of our nurse coordinator time was spent in this process. So we have 600 patients. Most of our patients are on 2 or 3 specialty pharmacy therapies. And so it's an endless cycle of time sink from my coordinators. Next slide. This led to my staff being heavily burdened with paperwork and just simply trying to bird dog where the prior authorization was in the process. Satisfaction was low on my coordinator side. Patients were frustrated that they couldn't see what was happening with their prior authorizations, and patients experienced delays in getting on therapy. And even though I have fantastic coordinators, the best we were doing was an average of 3 to 7 days to get patients on therapy, and sometimes it could be a couple weeks. And the most frustrating part on our end is we never knew where we were. So as we pushed paperwork into this portal, the faxes, we never had an ability to get on the computer and look and see, have we done our part correctly? Do we need to put pressure on the specialty pharmacy? Is it a problem on the patient end that they haven't returned phone calls? And so that led to great frustrations on our part. Next slide. So much like a street in Boston, which is very circuitous, the path to getting patients on therapy was filled with turns and frustrations. It was not uncommon if we submitted prior authorization to one specialty pharmacy for the specialty pharmacy to let us know that they weren't contracted. This is not something we had any visibility into. And so then the process would have to start over with a different specialty pharmacy, and so on and so on. And if you can imagine the iterative process here, as you get up to 600 patients, the time sink is just monumental. Next slide. So this led to a search for a solution. In 2016, we had a chat with Dr. Chanik, who's now at Mass General, and he told us that he'd started working with ZAPP, and we were immediately intrigued at the prospects of using technology to leverage my coordinator's capabilities and our infrastructure and make us more efficient. And so we reached out to ZAPP, and we were able to, in very, very short time course, initiate a pilot and then move on in an iterative process to a formal launch, which we started basically at the end of 2017. Sorry, excuse me, the end of 2016. And we've now, since the beginning of this year, we've been prescribing almost exclusively for our specialty pharmacy meds through the ZAPP platform. Next slide. So here we have that timeline laid out a little bit. We went from the initial product demo to contracting in a little bit less than a month. We then had about another month for a go live. And then the implementation was painless. ZAPP came out to our facility. They brought their tech team, and they were able to write some code which interacted with our electronic medical record in a way that we specified. So we have specific information that they're allowed access to, and we have other information that they're blocked from. So things like demographic information, insurance information, and other medications are fed into the ZAPP system from our electronic health record, with other information being withheld. We then had a brief individualized training and on-site go-live support with some small iteration changes that were made, which led to even more efficiencies in the system. And within a few weeks, we were actually fully implemented. Next slide. So since we launched ZAPP at our site, we've put in more than 200 prescriptions. The vast majority of our prescriptions now are done on ZAPP. And our first time prior approval rate of success would be 100%, except the physicians are fickle. And we changed our mind on one patient and redirected their therapy to another agent, thereby giving us a 96.9 first time prior approval rating, which is really fantastic. This is significantly higher than what we would experience in the old system. And what has this meant for my team? Well, first of all, the team's thrilled in that we're spending far less time pushing paperwork and faxes and trying to herd cats. And my coordinators are spending far more time interacting with patients. And what has it meant for patients is that patients get on therapy faster. And from a health system standpoint, one of the great frustrations that we'd have would be when patients would decline clinically in the interim between when we saw them and initiated the prior authorization, which sometimes would result in their being hospitalized. Or if a payer was being very difficult and refusing to give us access to a medication and the patient was declining, we would actually just put them in the hospital, gain leverage with the payer, help persuade them to see that they really need this expensive therapy. And so since we've been able to implement ZAPP platform, we really haven't had to do that because the prior approval process has been so much more efficient for us. Next slide. So my staff found this incredibly easy to use. We've been able to decrease our prior authorization approval time from 3 to 7 days down to 0 to 3 days. We often get prior approvals now within 24 hours. It's given us enormous visibility into the prescribing process. So whereas previously we really could have no idea where we were, we now can see on a step-by-step level where the information is, where the holdups are, and how close we are to the medications being approved and dispensed. Most importantly, and I can't emphasize this enough, is that by the time we're fully implemented with all of our patients in this system, the annual renewal process, each year we have to reauthorize all of these medications. And so if we have 600 patients and each patient's on, say, an average of 2.5 therapies, you can see that we have more than 1,200 prior authorizations to do each January. And so with the ZAPP RX platform, this will be extremely simplified. Basically, information is all pre-populated. My coordinators won't have to input any new information. If there's changes in payer source, this will already be pre-populated through our EHR feed. And so this will save us at least 75% of the time. This means that instead of having to hire an additional coordinator, my coordinators are able to dedicate more time to the important clinical activities rather than the administrative activities of prior authorization. Next slide. Here's some analytics that are relatively recent. So since 2017, we've put in 200 therapies. You can see that we get a breakdown by specific therapy as well as by manufacturer. The ability for us to have some granularity here is further emphasized by the next slide. If we hover over any of the slices of the wheel, we get patient level granularity. Now this clearly isn't our patient information, but we get patient level information, which is extremely helpful. So if our patients are traveling and are trying to connect with us and my coordinators are remote from the EHR, we can still get into this system very easily and identify exactly what they're on. We can see which specialty pharmacy is providing the medication, and we also can see dates that things have started. Next slide. We can get month-by-month data, which allows us to track our prescribing patterns. This is useful if we're trying to figure out, directionally whether we're using more of one medication or another medication. Previously, we would have to go to our spreadsheet, which we attempted to maintain as best we could, but it really required a lot of coordinator time just to maintain that spreadsheet. So by the end of this year, we will be fully enrolled in this in terms of all patient therapies for pulmonary hypertension in our practice will be within this platform. Next slide. So our staff have really positive feedback for us. When I ask them what do they think about this, the answers are uniformly extremely positive. They're spending far more time working with patients and less time working with paperwork. Patients are getting their therapies faster, which means patient satisfaction is up. And it's led to reduced job stresses, because one of the most frustrating things is to have a sick patient who's doing poorly and we're running into roadblocks and trying to get medications authorized. Next slide. In addition to the pulmonary hypertension area, ZAPP RX's platform extends into multiple other areas. As Karen mentioned, this includes oncology, neurology, gastroenterology, and rheumatology. And here are a couple vignettes from patients that have interacted with the ZAPP RX system and previous system. For example, Lily Stairs, who's got psoriatic arthritis and Crohn's disease, and she expressed a sentiment which is all too common, which is that why should she have to waste her time talking through all sorts of administrative hurdles in order to figure out what's happening with her medication. And Anna Lagasse has another very common frustration, which is that even if the doctor's office does everything right, pushes paperwork through, gets the prior authorization, with infused therapies, for example, for the rheumatologic diseases, there's yet another piece, which is the infusion center. And so the infusion center has to have medication delivered, and that if there is a hang up in any one of those areas, there's a delay in the patient getting therapy. And delays in patient therapy are critically important, irrespective of the disease process, whether it's pulmonary hypertension or neurologic disorders or rheumatologic disorders. Patients without medications are patients that are getting worse. And that's not good for the patient. It's not good for patient satisfaction. It's not good for best outcomes. Next slide. We're not alone in using ZAPP-RX. The early adopters include colleagues at Tufts Medical Center, Dr. Preston, Washington University in St. Louis, Dr. Chakanala, Dr. Champion out at Southeastern Cardiology, Dr. Udiz at Harbor UCLA. And the feedback in my chats with my colleagues has been uniformly extremely positive. To an individual, they all report dramatic improvements in efficiency in their practice, improvements in their satisfaction, their coordinator satisfaction, and also, very importantly, patient satisfaction. Increasingly, patient satisfaction is a metric that is being weighed in decisions about reimbursement. And so anything that we can do to improve patient satisfaction is certainly a plus. Next slide. And just to reiterate and summarize, my staff spend far less time working with papers. We're able to spend more time taking care of patients. We have transparency for where we are in the process. That's not just for us, but also for the patients. Real cost savings from efficiencies in reducing paperwork, and the ability to have my staff do more in the same time that they were spending has just been tremendous. We can track our performance. We know exactly what medications we're prescribing. We can figure out which specialty pharmacies we're using. And this has allowed us to continue to grow in an extremely cost-conscious and efficient manner. Next slide. Patients receive medications more quickly. This is a huge plus. If you've ever talked to a patient who's sitting there waiting for their medication, there's few things that are more frustrating. Perhaps the only thing that's more frustrating is not knowing why a delay is taking place, and the ZAPP-RX platform is a solution to that. Because the coordinators are more available, they're able to spend more time with them, and this leads to better satisfaction. Next slide. So the last thing that I want to touch on is where I hope that we're going to be able to go with ZAPP-RX. And, you know, in this era of increasing scrutiny on healthcare utilization, there is a model that's coming down through the Pulmonary Hypertension Association called the Comprehensive Care Centers of Excellence. And we're very optimistic that through interactions between the Pulmonary Hypertension Association and ZAPP-RX, that we will be able to set up the equivalent of the Trusted Traveler program, where Comprehensive Care Centers of Excellence will be green-lighted through the ZAPP-RX platform, so that prior authorizations may even be a thing of the past. Imagine a scenario where our center here in Phoenix, which is a comprehensive care center, has a special tag on it when we prescribe electronically, and that tag allows the payers to know that we've been well vetted, we're recognized as the National Center of Excellence, and that they can dispense with the prior authorization process for medications in the diseases that we manage in our Center of Excellence. So this could result in huge cost savings for payers that don't have to spend the resources on prior authorizations. It will result in shorter onboarding time for patients getting their medications, and it will further reduce the amount of energy that my practice has to spend in the prior authorization process. So we're very excited about that, and we see that as the eventual holy grail at the end of this quest to improve the efficiency and speed of the prior authorization process. And with that, we'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thanks, Dr. Feldman. As he said, now we'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. As a reminder, please use the questions section on the GoToWebinar panel to submit your question. The first one looks like it's for you, Dr. Feldman. What is the biggest way this technology has impacted patient care at your practice?
It's a great question. I think it's impacted patient care in a couple different ways. Number one is the simple time commodity. Patients get their medications faster. Number two is from a business standpoint, we spend less resources in getting patients on therapies. So patients are getting their medicines. We're doing that with less work, which means that patients are happier, like nurses are happier, and if my nurses are happy, happy nurse equals happy doctor.
How did the paperwork impact staff at Arizona Pulmonary Specialists? Was there staff burnout or turnover?
Well, it's a huge issue. You know, if you're spending a third of your time filling out paperwork, and you know the reason you went into nursing it has nothing to do with filling out paperwork. You go into nursing because you want to deliver patient care, and so this led to frustrations, and it had a spiraling effect on morale in the office. We've seen that turn around handsomely with the implementation of the ZAPP platform.
Okay, Francis would like to know, how does ZAPP get medical records of the patients from the physician's office?
So good question. So some of the information is fed into the platform. If they want other information, that can be loaded into the platform as well. So it either can be on an auto feed where the information is pulled from the electronic health record, or it can be fed into it sort of in a drop and drag format.
Okay, what is the biggest difference in your practice since using ZAPP?
I think it's the issue that we've touched on, which is that we are nimbler. We're able to move more quickly in getting patients on therapy. The delays that we used to struggle with, I mean, even a 1 week delay is frustrating if you have a patient that's doing poorly. And so we've been able to really condense that latency between when we want to start someone on therapy and when they're started on therapy. And so from a practice standpoint, patient care delivery is improved. And from a business management standpoint, I have to spend less resources to do the same thing, which means I can grow without having new coordinators.
Maggie would like to know if ZAPP works with all EHRs.
Maybe Karen can handle that one.
Yeah, happy to take that. I mean, the short answer is yes. As long as your EHR can communicate, through standard protocols, either FHIR, HL7, or API, we can connect into you. And even a lighter weight integration, which is often how we start, is if you've got some canned reports in your EHR that can produce things like a patient list with some of the data elements that Dr. Feldman laid out, like demographics, insurance, medication lists, those sorts of things. We could even start just taking those files and uploading them to the system so that we don't have to wait for IT resources to become available. That we can just start with simple flat file reports that are pretty much canned in most EHRs today, and get you started.
Terrific. I think this one's for Dr. Feldman. James would like to know if you saw any appreciable impact on patient outcomes.
Good question. I think the most direct thing that we've seen is that we haven't had to put patients in the hospital in order to expedite them getting on therapy. Now the reasons that we put patients in the hospital really are strictly clinically based. If I have a patient that I really want to put on subcutaneous treprostinil, for example, and the insurance company is telling me that they're going to get back to me in 2 to 3 weeks with an answer, it means that I might have a 1 month delay because the specialty pharmacy isn't going to initiate education until they have a prior authorization approved. And so a month delay is really a long time. We have some compelling data from Ron Udiz's analysis of the ARIES studies that delays of 12 weeks, for example, in that study were never caught up, even when therapies were started. So the placebo group in that study never had full catch up to the group that started on therapy. So in that sense, that this has profoundly affected our ability to shorten that latency. We don't have to spend resources in the hospital. That makes payers happier. So it's been a big win for us.
I think this one is for Karen. How how did ZAPP-RX get across the red tape of information security at larger institutions like Tufts or Mass?
Yeah, I'll start by saying there's no silver bullet, but the reality is that we take security very seriously, and the infrastructure that we've built around our product shows that. And so as we've gone through each of these academic medical centers' InfoSec processes, we've been able to get over that line because of the diligence that we have in our technology team behind the scenes. And I'm not going to say it's not the pain-free process that everyone would like, but we are going to have high trust certification in the next quarter, and so hopefully that will make things go even faster for us.
Okay, I think this one is for you too, Karen. James would like to know, how can I get this technology at my practice, and how long does it take?
Wow, that was a softball. Thank you. You should see my my screen still showing the zapprx.com/demo, and that will connect you with our sales team, and we'd be happy to set up a demo for you. We're happy to do that in a customized way. We'll do individual demos for you, and potentially even come to your site and get to know your workflow today better, so that we can really help figure out what we could do for you.
Terrific. Well, that was our last question, so this will conclude our webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Karen and Dr. Feldman, for the interesting and informative presentation. As a reminder to attendees, watch your email for links to the recording of today's webinar, as well as the PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. And we look forward to seeing you at our next HIS Talk webinar, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.